Hello and welcome to episode 85 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern and the new format that is called Pioneer. We're jumping right into it. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane Beeps.
Dan, you got the tank on, going for just full tank mode.
That's right.
Is that a band tank top? I see a little guitar.
It is, yeah. It's this local band called White Mystery. Fun fact, this is the only tank top I own.
Yeah, it looks good. Wear it all time.
Only when it's super hot. Also with us, the Godfather, Dave Harbarger.
In strict contrast to Stan's tank top, I'm wearing a button-down shirt and a lovely cravat.
Is that a flannel?
I'm bringing class and sophistication to what's sure to be a hot episode of The Dive Down.
Both of you guys are wearing button-downs. I thought it was Casual Monday.
Yeah, I've been wearing t-shirts for like 3 straight months. So I decided let's get fancy.
Man, I better step it up. On this week's episode, we're diving into the one-drops that could with our in-depth look at the Neapolitan flavors of Prowess. We'll discuss how splashing blue, black, or green have changed the identity of this nearly 2-year-old archetype, and maybe even have a lively debate about why good decks can run bad cards.
And that's going to be about Modern, and there's nothing to talk about ever in Pioneer, so we're just skipping it this week.
Yeah, nothing interesting or newsworthy happened in the Magic world this week, so no breakdown.
Guys,
What?
I know it's been busy at work, but there was a pretty big banning.
I mean, I'm onboarding at a new job.
There was a ban announcement this
What?
morning.
But there wasn't an announcement of the announcement.
What?
I know. It was kind of out of nowhere. I was watching. I was F5ing as I do every morning on the mothership because I need to get that hot WotC content.
Is that your homepage portal? Did you set it up as your auto load?
Yeah, and then when something changes, Clippy tells me, "Hey, this webpage changed. Check it out." And I'm like, "Cool, Clippy."
Check it out.
But yeah, there's some big stuff.
So wait, there was a ban. So what did they just did they just get rid of I don't know, ban Thoughtseize or get rid
Wild
of
Slash?
something? Yeah, Wild Slash.
I think it's a little. There's a few. How about you guys? I'll do the housekeeping. I'll do all the housekeeping. You guys go read. I'll send you the link to the BNR announcement and do some housekeeping. How about that?
Yeah, I'll go cram.
Okay. Thanks to new patron Eric E. Appreciate you joining the Dive Down Nation. Increased tier members, longtime buddies, hanger outers in the super secret Slack server, Jason W. and Dom M. We appreciate you guys moving up a tier. They are pushing for these deck boxes. Our stretch goal, they specifically are like, hey, we want these deck boxes. We still have a little while to go. If you are interested in joining the Dive Down Nation, helping us out, throwing us $1 or more a week, then you can go to patreon.com/thedivedown. $1 a week gets you access to the super secret Slack server. We're always hanging out, chatting there. Moving up from there gets you various benefits like access to the show notes. You can get the episode early. It's getting pretty reliably like a day or two early, which is sweet. We get stuff like play mats, tokens, signed cards, all that kind of cool stuff that you would expect from a podcast as professional as ours. So yeah, come help us out. We appreciate it.
Shane,
Dave, Google Ian Duke.
you know where you should go if you want to know about band announcements?
Oh, hold on.
mtgbandswen.com, right?
I usually go to mtgbandswen.com.
That's my homepage.
Yeah, that's actually the best way to find out about bands because Dave made this webpage a few months ago, and we update it when there's an announcement of an announcement of an announcement, or when announcements happen like they did today. New reviews. So we asked last week, we said, hey, we hadn't had a review in a while. We got 7 new reviews. We should do this every week.
Thanks, everybody.
So we haven't had any reviews in a while, everybody. So this week, get out there and do it again. But really, thanks to Steven 070409. You must really like cleaning sprays. Sugar Bandit, Sir Jaco, ALC321, Squirrler Virtuoso, good name, Andrew D, and Matthios. So thanks for your reviews. We appreciate your feedback and helping us be found on stuff like iTunes. Do you guys have a chance to read that now?
I'm still interneting.
I found the clip notes.
All right. I'll just go to I'll go to the Mana Traders promo. So Mana Traders, They are awesome. We have used them for a long time. We now get 20% off first 3 months for new subscribers who use code The Dive Down, all one word. Mana traders, you know what this does now, right? You go there, you give them a little bit of money. They let you rent Magic Online cards, at which you can then play in formats of your choosing. And that's really good. You can practice any deck, which is sweet. You don't have to like sell cards to bots and stuff like that. It just works so well. They do run those monthly events. We talked about the Modern 15K last month that happened. And also you get better prize support in their events when you're a subscriber. And what's cool is you don't have to be a subscriber to play in their events.
It's free money.
They're moving on. It's free money.
It's free real estate.
It's free Magic the Gathering. It is free because you can play in the tournament practice room.
Thank you so much to manatraders.com. Use code. Did we get a new code?
No, it's still the same code.
Okay. Use code The Dive Down, all one word, to get 20% off your first 3 months.
Okay, Stan. I talked through all that so that you could read. You ready for this?
You didn't talk through that so I could do like bad radio Foley bits.
No, I like it. That was a good bit.
I am ready. So I did not actually have to cram. I was there when the most legendary BNR of all time happened.
I mean, you kind of spoil it in the intro that you knew.
Did I?
Force ranking BNR announcements. This is up. This is at the top for you. One of the top ones.
Yeah, this was a big one. It was a surprise. Stunning surprise of the century, I say.
Very true.
So tell us about this, Stan.
Yeah, so Monday morning, Dateline, Renton, Washington, published a new banned and restricted announcement without giving their usual week's notice. And we say usual, but they've only been doing this like this year. So we got used to it quick, but definitely a surprise.
Small digression. There was a poll posted by, I believe it was by Aaron Forsyth today that said, do you want us to give you notice or not for banned announcements? And 75% of respondents said no.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not expect them to keep up with the announcement of an announcement thing from now on. But just a small aside there. Let's get to the real story, Stan.
Yes, what actually changed? Modern, no changes. Pioneer, 4 changes. Sit down, guys. Are you sitting?
I am.
I can't tell if you're using a standing desk. All right, in Pioneer.
I'm in chair pose. I do this for 2 hours.
I know that this is going to be so hot I had to unbutton one more button on my shirt.
Inverter of Truth, banned.
What?
Kethis, the Hidden Hand, banned.
What?
Who? Walking Ballista, banned.
Huh?
Oh no, not Walking Ballista.
Underworld Breach, banned.
Yeah.
Man, that's a lot of cards.
This is real.
Real. So combo is banned. Good combo is banned.
Apparently. Dave finally got his wish where creature combat matters.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I feel like this is a weird alternate timeline to the episode that you all did with Everett about 3 weeks ago when I was out of town, where it's kind of like, we're just going to go back and redo the band announcement that we made a few weeks ago. Sorry.
Do you believe it was already 3 weeks ago?
I mean, it was fast. Yeah, I mean, that 3 weeks went quick. I was surprised when I thought about it.
Before we really get into the meat of the article, really quick, are you guys generally happy, generally unhappy? Give me your knee-jerk reactions.
I'm generally happy with the results of the banning, or like the cards that were banned, I think are all probably fine to be banned. The issue, however, is I'm not really, just as I was 3 weeks ago, I think the messaging here is poor. And I'll get into aspects of why I think that's the case as we go through the announcement, as we usually do. I think long story short, WotC gave in. That's what I feel like. You know, the kids whined long enough that they went to get ice cream.
Yeah, but it's great. The ice cream is so good. And you don't have to put Walking Ballista on top anymore, or you don't have to put Kethis on top of your sundae anymore. You can have other kinds of sundaes again. It's like Baskin Robbins suddenly went from Baskin Robbins 4 to Baskin Robbins 31 again, and I am ready for that.
What Blizzard do you get, Dave?
Chocolate peanut butter, Reese's, that kind of thing is always my thing.
That sounds good. Stan, Blizzard take.
I like the dilly bars.
Wow.
I like anything that once had Dennis the Menace on it in the old school DQ.
Shane, what about your answer? You didn't give your answer.
Oh, Butterfinger, vanilla ice cream. That's all I need.
So the Pioneer article is kind of long, actually. I'm not going to read the whole thing word for word, but there were some excerpts that I do want to discuss and I think gave us really interesting insight into really R&D's decision-making process over the last 3 weeks since their last BNR. The article kicks off with the last banned and restricted list update. We chose to unban Oath of Nissa and Pioneer. This wasn't intended to be a major update to the format or an alternative to other changes, but rather what we viewed as a relatively safe unban in the context of a metagame that was looking healthy by many metrics, if you say so.
Stop right there. Yeah, there's just one more sentence. But I did not actually read the announcement until just now. Wow.
What were you doing?
I just read the list of cards.
What were you doing when I was reading all that stuff?
But then I did Foley bits, but I didn't read all of the paragraphs. I kind of skimmed it. That sentence, a metagame that was looking healthy by many metrics. Where you guys been? Where you been?
Oh, don't worry. We haven't heard the last of the very healthy metagame in this BNR yet.
Okay.
They go on to say that much community discussion followed that update, prompting us to take a further look at the need for change in Pioneer. So, a couple things I like here. A, acknowledgement that they heard us. The community is the dive down, and I guess other podcasts, players, people on Twitter, Reddit, and beyond.
I mean, Stan, Aaron Forsyth got your tweet. That's what it is.
That's right. I can only assume he reads everyone who ats him.
Look, this community discussion was happening before this update, or before that update, 3 weeks ago. This is not new community discussion. I go like, well, our lack of action in Pioneer led to much community discussion. It's like, no, you all knew this was happening beforehand too. It's disingenuous again.
Yeah, I am a little worried that none of us were never going to get a preview card if the tenor of this discussion continues the way that it's going. But let's go on. It's fun. Let's have fun.
I'll get less mocking.
Listen, we do this for the fans, not for the WotC suits.
You know, it's fine with me.
They're probably business casual, let's be honest.
If you want to have it be a burn book, this episode, this breakdown is the episode burn book. We'll do it.
The article continues, although we continue to see many different decks have success in Pioneer, and no decks with problematic win rates against the field, as they keep telling us, we do see that combo decks as a group make up a large portion of the competitive metagame. We've heard feedback that the frequency at which one finds themselves facing an opposing combo deck restricts deck building options and can make play experiences unenjoyable. While win rate data may not point to change being needed, a different, more important set of data does. Player participation. Why are they like reinforcing this that we're wrong? I don't understand the need to keep telling us that the data's okay. I don't get it.
And player participation was already poor.
Yeah, I don't get what the benefit to them is to say this. Any of this is really so weird. I will say I do like that they acknowledge here something that we've talked about a little bit, which is that perception is a little bit of reality in Magic when it comes to if people want to play your game or not. And especially in a format that is full of enfranchised players, if they think it's boring, they will either stop or go to a different formats, and many of them will stop. And so I like that they're acknowledging what the most important metric is, which is how many people are showing up.
Yeah, I mean, totally agreed. I wish the messaging was a little less passive-aggressive, but I didn't write this. I'm just reading it. We've also seen a decline in Pioneer play rates on Magic Online throughout the course of the year. Ultimately, how much fun players are having with the environment is the most important driving force behind BNR updates. So we're choosing to ban fork cards to shake things up and push the competitive metagame away from combo decks. So we're choosing to ban cards to shake things up. Is, I will say, a welcome change here, but not something I necessarily want to see in future BNRs as the sole reason to make a change to a format.
Yeah, I don't really like this like overtly expressed reasoning of shaking things up. I think it's a pretty poor driving factor. Like, hey, you all aren't playing. You all were vocal. Metagame's fine, but we're going to shake things up. Like 3 weeks ago, they used community sentiment, deck building restrictions due to the presence of Tron, repetitive gameplay as these rationales for their pauper ban of just Expedition Map, right? And instead of being what I would consider to be somewhat reasonable, WotC here just says, fine, you want change, here's your change. We're shaking things up, Jerry. It's just like this irrational sounding statement to me from them. Do you know what I mean? It's like it doesn't come from like a place of like temper and reasoning. Like even their 3 week ago announcement was just sort of like, fine, we're shaking things up.
Well, just to be clear, what you're saying is that they essentially banned Expedition Map for the same reason as they're banning these cards. Is that what you're saying? But the tone of the way they said it here is like unnecessary. Is that where you're coming from?
Yeah, I think the tone here is just a little bit like it's not coming from like their usually hyper reasonable sort of arguments. And it's just sort of like, yeah, our argument now is just like you don't like it, so we'll change it.
The win rate data, Shane. The data wasn't there.
I know. I don't want to repeat my stuff from 3 weeks ago here. What? It's just like I don't love this stance.
Yeah, just to be clear, it's not that you don't love the stance, it's that you don't love the way it's delivered. Or
Okay,
is that
that's
wrong?
fair. That's fair.
Because you're fine with them banning these cards, A. I'm not wrong about that, am I? You're fine with them banning
Well,
these
hold
cards.
on. This I guess it depends on the use of the word stance, right? Because who is that batter that had like he held the bat like Kirby Puckett held the bat really funny? I don't like his stance, but I like when he hit home runs.
Jim Thome did that weird waggle thing, you know.
That's just setting yourself up.
All right, look. No, I don't mean to like belabor this, Shane, but I genuinely look, my take is that I am totally fine with these reasons for banning these cards. A. B, I'm totally fine with banning these cards. C, this announcement seems like it was kind of hastily written and poorly edited, and like
Sure.
nobody went over it for tone and said, let's take our foot off the gas. But whatever. The net is fine.
Yeah, it's like my first drafts before you guys tone me down.
Not to get too nitpicky because diminishing returns, but I think to call this a shakeup is a little disingenuous. I consider a shakeup when a new set comes out, you inject a bunch of new technology into a format, and people have new cards and tools to play with. I think that's a shakeup. This is a correction. This is the format went into a direction that was unhealthy and unsustainable for the player base, and they had to essentially reverse course to make it more engaging for the people who were no longer participating.
Love it. Hire this guy
Yeah.
to write your press releases.
Which is sort of
Wizards.
fitting, unfortunately, with sort of the last year plus of Magic. Like you look at the BNR history wiki, and like 2020 is just, 2019 and 2020 is just bonkers list compared to, 5 years before that even.
So one of the surprising cards on this list was Kethis, the Hidden Hand, and I think a lot of people, us included on the podcast, shared a little trepidation when Oath of Nissa was unbanned, that now the format might just become 4 combo decks instead of 3. But they acted quickly and wrote, while Kethis combo decks are a relatively new reemergence in the metagame, we're seeing signs that these decks are already problematic and would become more so if other top decks were weakened. Kethis decks are currently among the top 5-0 trophy winners in Magic Online Pioneer Leagues, despite being a modest portion of the field.
The win rates on Kethis apparently were bad.
Yeah, it's a powerful deck.
I want to know specifically which deck they felt like did not have a high enough win rate. They never told us. Are they just saying that Inverter is a sub 50% deck? Is that what the code for the win rates aren't problematic is? Because that's exactly what this says. Kethis is among the top 5-0 trophy winners despite being a modest portion of the field. Not many people are playing it, but lots of people are trophying with it, is what they're saying.
Out of curiosity, have any of you guys played against Kethis?
I have not recently, but I definitely have faced it, I don't know, half dozen times probably. It's a very annoying deck to play against because it doesn't operate on some of the traditional aspects of Magic that people are used to. And that's not an excuse for banning it by any means, right? But I have heard it compared to even something like KCI. And I don't think that's entirely disingenuous because I think there's some weird interactions and weird card text that the pilot gets. And some inexperienced opponents, even myself, are kind of like, I think I know what's going to happen here. And I think I know how I want to stop it, but I don't really know what's going on. And then at some point loops happen and then you likely die. And combine the gameplay patterns with the power inherent in the strategy. And I think that's the kind of deck that typically doesn't last too long. It usually doesn't go this quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this got banned pretty quickly after Oath came back, but I think it's probably a good take to just get it out of there before it can have a chance to be the new combo deck and make everyone mad again, and they have to revisit it again.
My only thing is, I think you beat Kethis with one of the same ways you would beat Breach is just graveyard hate. Like, I don't think Kethis can win through a Rest in Peace. All right, so the article goes on. Our intent is to dramatically reduce instances where players risk losing to a combo kill when tapping out in the early to mid game. This should open up the field for more traditional mid-range and control decks and put less pressure on aggressive decks to also focus on hand disruption and counter spells. Man, I love that sentence. The cards we've chosen are the set that gives us the most confidence in creating a significant shift in the metagame. So what I think they're saying is that they believe this change means Mono Black won't run Thoughtseize anymore, and maybe something like Ensoul won't have to run Metallic Rebuke.
I don't think that's what that says. I think what that says is the only aggressive decks that were good were ones that had access to Thoughtseize and counter spells, like hand disruption and counter spells. I think what they're trying to say is that the field will be more open to aggressive decks that are just fast, as opposed to ones that must run this kind of interaction in order to be viable. There's no reason for Black to not run Thoughtseize. It's just one of the best cards. It'll still run it because of that reason, just for value, I think. But so I think it's more about widening the field of aggro.
And I think that's going to be necessary because of what we're going to talk about pretty soon in terms of what's going to happen to the metagame, I think. Aggro decks are going to have to be able to just be aggro decks soon.
The part I didn't read was their reasoning for banning Inverter over something like Oracle, and basically that was just to ensure that the deck would, stay nerfed without this super reliable enabler, and the presence of Jace meant that Inverter could still threaten combo kills out of nowhere. And at least now that without Inverter, there's no I win button in the deck.
Yeah, maybe we should talk briefly about what wasn't banned, and that was also dig through time. And I think one of the big sentiments in the community is kind of like, Inverter didn't have to go. Inverter is the most fun I've had playing Magic. A lot of really good players would say some stuff like that. And we've talked about this in the past, where like the Inverter mirror is definitely a skill testing environment. And they're like, well, I think Inverter should have stayed. Maybe just ban Dig Through Time. And Dig Through Time is a problematic card that's going to have to go anyways. Let's just do it now. And like you said, Stan, I think it's just because they just wanted to make this deck no longer viable, not a thing. And so the surest way to do that is just say, buy Inverter, and we can handle Dig later. I mean, I really think that Dig is probably the only thing keeping a blue-based control deck even like conceivable in the format right now, and they're not overpowered.
There's just no way to know right now, Shane. Honestly, I mean, I know that you have your take about what's going to be really good. We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of second level effects that'll happen from these bans that are unanticipated by people metagaming against the decks that come to the top. I mean, I saw somebody be like, I got a 5-0 with Torrential Gearhulk today. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, people are out there on Twitter throwing out some wild stuff. So who knows where things are going to settle? And that's what makes me excited about this. Although, I haven't been super enthusiastic to dip in a Pioneer in a long time. Maybe I'll give it a try again. I'm more focused on Modern.
Stan, talk about perhaps one of the most interesting things. We've already kind of touched on it, which is there was no advance notice on this.
That's right. They wrote, in the past, we've given a 1-week advance notice for updates to the BNR list. Because of the increased focus on digital play environments during this time period, namely pandemic and quarantine, we're choosing to forego that advance notice and roll out these changes as soon as possible. This isn't necessarily indicative of how we'll announce and implement in the future, and we're continuing to look at how we balance giving players advance notice versus staying agile with respect to changing metagames. I'm curious, how do you guys feel about this method of announcement today? Do you prefer the surprise approach? Do you want a week-long advance? Or maybe even the scheduled BNRs that we've had for like years prior?
I think this is the way to do it. I voted for that option in Aaron Forsyth's poll. I think it's just what you need to do. Like, take care of the issues when you have it. Whenever you create a border that everyone knows about, you create opportunities for weird financial arbitrage and dead formats and all kinds of things. And I think it's probably best to just say, we're going to ban something when it has to be banned. That's it.
For sure. I think this is how BNR should just happen. Just bring it on. Like, the pre-announcements, I mean, the only thing they really felt like they gave us was a week of conversation and speculation. And ultimately, that's just kind of needless and worthless in the end. I mean, it's fun, it's a topic, but it's not something that's really productive, I think, fundamentally. So this just cuts to the chase.
Agreed. I think it just makes tournaments better too. Dave, you sort of alluded to this, but when you don't have dead formats or you don't have like upcoming big events, I think it just makes like these BNRs kind of easier for players to just sort of embrace in real time and, be as agile as WotC wants to be with the news.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to have to be cognizant of things like modern Grand Prix once in 2022 we get back to, some kind of normalcy, hopefully. But that's a ways off, like they said. And also, hopefully, they'll just be aware of it.
I mean, people may not agree, but I actually think a ban the week before a Grand Prix would make for a very exciting Grand Prix, especially if there's coverage at that event, which are not always the case at GPs.
It's an exciting viewer experience. It's tough for people who are deck masters or whatever, who have a deck selected out and are planning to go to the GP and have spent money, et cetera, et cetera. So I hear that, but
it's a classic double-edged blade.
Yeah. This blade has two edges.
All right, let's react. A lot of news. We don't want to go too long into the breakdown, but we do have some feelings. What do you guys think maybe some of the short to near term to midterm to long term impacts on Pioneer?
I think the best thing is I believe that we will have a dynamic metagame again, because the biggest problem with the inverter / combo meta was that it sort of created the tier 0, the S tier decks that the format had to consider and warp themselves around, right? I think that people are generally in agreement with this concept. And now that there isn't that just sort of static best deck or best set of decks to choose from, I think decks can then, and players can respond to the metagame like we saw early on in Pioneer, like we see somewhat often in Modern, like the best standards have the capability of being. So I think that's the best aspect of it. In terms of like strategies or decks that will get better, briefly, I think when combo goes, it's time to go over the top. Like I think 5-color Niv is already showing up again, with Oath of Nissa being a nice card in that strategy. And I think 5-color Niv is what we saw as a response to like the large mid-range red decks and things like that, where it's like, hey, I'm just going to go over the top of you with Niv. And I think green or Simic Ramp is definitely going to make a comeback, because it doesn't really need to worry about getting comboed out as it's setting itself up. I think those are two decks and styles of decks that I can see, and strategies I can just see coming back. Is we don't have to worry about combo. Let's get my sort of uninteractive setup thing going. And Niv is very interactive though, and just go over the top with like my Ugins and my Uros and my gigantic Hydroid Crazies.
I don't know if I have a good take here. I just hope that I get to play some different aggro decks other than mono black, I guess, because I'm that guy on the podcast now. I'm the aggro guy. Bring me Boros Feather. Make it good again.
And it might be, because it's going to become more of a board-based format. It's likely, and so the interaction while being aggressive of stuff like Feather is likely to have more gameplay. I think losing Ballista is actually kind of a bad thing, because it's going to put a hurt on Green Devotion and like the Green Walkers deck, just because that's a great thing to do with mana. If there's any lingering sort of hardened scales players out there, that's not great for them. But I'm hyped to play Bant Ramp. I sold my Uros in paper a little while ago, but paper doesn't really exist right now, so I can just rent them on MetaTraders.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that Ballista ban, like that's the card they decided to ban there, is kind of interesting to me, because they left Nykthos, which is arguably a pretty broken card as well. They left Heliod, which, still can do some not infinite stuff, but still could possibly be good in a shell. I wonder if we'll find another outlet for some of the for that whole engine or not.
Yeah, so something that I noticed was Today's Monday's Pioneer 5.0 dump had 19 different decks, and the league results from last Thursday, I believe, had 17. So I think one place to keep an eye on, like health and format diversity, is just the number of decks we see in these dumps, and hopefully that number increases. Like Modern is in the 20 to 30 range. Sometimes it gets even higher. Like we've seen 40 decks in Modern. Very different format, of course, but I'd love to see this just like get wider, and not being wide because there's like 2 or 3 versions of Burn or 2 or 3 versions of Spirits, but rather like genuine variety between archetypes. I do think there's some very powerful decks in Pioneer right now that are going to stay just as good, if not get better, because they don't have to worry about goldfishing a combo strategy, which is like Naya Winota. As far as I know, still the only deck in Pioneer that can threaten a turn 3 kill. So if the format gets more mid-rangey, there's more removal. Maybe there's like ways to interact with Winota's early plays, but I think that's a deck you can kind of keep an eye on.
I mean, look to cards that are banned in other formats to see what might be good in Pioneer now, right? Like Wilderness Reclamation is not banned in Pioneer, and Winota is not banned in Pioneer. So just keep an eye out for those cards.
I will say, as soon as I had some free time this evening before we jumped on to record, I actually joined a Pioneer League for like the first time since we did our Winota episode, I think.
And what deck were you piloting?
Izzet in Soul.
I knew it.
Back to the
I didn't even have to ask.
I only got to play one match, but the first match was a good one. It was against Soulflare.
Okay.
So that wraps up our breakdown for this week. Really excited to see what happens in Pioneer. Maybe next week we can do a full Pioneer episode to see how this impact changes the metagame on week 1.
Yeah, I'd love to go back to Pioneer for some testing and some experimentation and see what's happening out there, see what people are playing.
Dust off our cowboy boots, put a piece of wheat in our mouth, and head on to Pioneer Town.
Circle the wagons, friends.
We're going to take a quick break now, and when we return, we are diving into Prowess in Modern, the red version and the other red versions. Stay with us. And we're back. So no one on the dive down claims to be really big-brained Modern players or Magic aficionados by any means, but I want to give us a little bit of credit, because I do think in like January of maybe 2019 or so, Mono Red Phoenix, featuring this 8 Prowess creatures as like the heart of this aggressive package, broke out, and one of the first things that we did was play this deck. And I really felt like for the first time in a long time, I was an early adopter of a strategy, and we even had a little bit of success at first, and it's been really fun watching this deck like evolve and go through the ebbs and flows of the format ever since. It's gone through a lot of changes, even been hit by bans at one point, and now many years later, it feels like there's 3 versions of this deck, if not 4. So today what we're going to do is talk about all the flavors of Prowess in maybe the most ambitious dive style episode yet. And Dave, as really the reigning Prowess champ on the show, the person who's never given up on this strategy, how does today make you feel?
It makes me feel like what I've always known in my heart to be true is actually true, and that's every week is Prowess week on the dive down when I'm here.
I like it.
I'm excited to talk about it. I mean, we have talked about this deck a couple times, and I constantly have talked about it over the last 3 weeks. So hopefully people aren't annoyed. So like Stan said, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's going on with the shell right now, but we're also going to talk a little bit about fundamentally trying to talk about what kind of deck is this, because I don't think that's a simple question. And I also think that we're going to have some different opinions among the 3 of us about what kind of deck this is. So we'll even take a swing at what one of Magic's big questions as part of that discussion. So let's see if you can guess what that is as we're talking. But at any rate, what's going on with Prowess right now? Well, the core of the deck is really familiar to anyone who has spent time in the queues on Magic Online. The red core of this deck, the 8/1 drops, 4 bolts, 4 Manamorphos, and 4 Light Up the Stage has been pretty stock since January of 2019. Just about. I actually don't think that Light Up the Stage was printed in January of 2019. When did Ravnica Allegiances come out? That would be...
Yeah, I remember when we talked about Spectacle pretty early.
That would literally be in January, I think. That would be like mid-January 20 is when that set came out. Because Guilds is the fall set. Allegiance is the winter set. And, I'm a frequent champion of the deck. Stan likes it sometimes. Shane says he likes it, but he always chats me asking why he isn't playing Burn when he's piloting it.
Look, Dave, I just don't want to have to cast Burst Lightning in a deck, okay?
I understand if it has Burst Lightning, I send it back. I don't generally put it in these decks either, but a lot of people are these days.
Fancy Shock.
It really isn't a unique thing that's happened with Prowess over the last few weeks, though, because it was a deck that generally had a strong monocolor identity kind of outside of the companion era that suddenly shifted into lots of different builds all at the same time. And while we've seen all of these different iterations at different points in time, suddenly, for example, in the Mana Traders tournament, we saw 3 different flavors of it in the top 8, I believe.
Yeah.
And many more through the top 32 and things like that.
Exactly.
Ban, Lava, Dart.
Right. It might be the best aggressive deck in Modern. It might not even really be an aggressive deck. Let's talk about what that term means a little bit later as well. But first, let's start with a quick primer on Mono Red Prowess and the core that seems to be persistent from build to build.
All right. So let's talk about the core of this deck, right? So Prowess and Prowess variants are decks built around, you may have guessed, the keyword Prowess. So, which reads, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And what's somewhat easy to overlook at times is that this isn't just instants and sorceries, even though it's primarily is what's supporting this in your game 1 game plan. Like your sideboard artifacts or enchantments or planeswalkers, if you're crazy, they all trigger Prowess. And that's a nice part of like the artifact power of Modern, in my opinion at least, because they can still help your early prowess damage while hindering the opponent's game plan. So you're playing like a 1 mana Grafdigger's Cage, well, that's 2 mana. You're playing like a 1 mana Relic of Progenitus. You're playing a 2 mana Grafdigger's Cage versus Dredge. You're stopping their game plan while advancing your own.
Even 0 mana Tormod's Crypt.
Tormod's Crypt.
Shane, Grafdigger's Cage costs 1 mana. I'm going to have to take some money out of your paycheck for that.
Oh man. Well, I was worried. I was checking myself. You think that a dredgeman like me would know how much Cage costs, but I haven't been playing Dredge in a long while. Prowess seems kind of innocuous. It seems a little simple, right? Like it's just a little temporary bonus on the turn that you're casting the spell. Why is this worthy of building a deck around? Outside of like an Izzet spells deck in Limited, right? Like the traditional blue-red spells or something. The reason is math just works, right? It all adds up. It adds up quickly.
2 + 2 = 5.
That's the best part about this deck. This is like Tron. This is Aggro-Tron, okay? 1 + 1 + 1 = 17. The most traditional Prowess builds, like the mono red ones, they have cheap creatures that have Prowess, cheap burn spells that trigger Prowess, cheap cantrips, in quotes, to put together a deck that you can lethal someone on turn 4 or maybe even turn 3 sometimes. In some of the other variants, you'll see that, and even the mono red deck, right? The burn spells that are cheap are sometimes a little bit weird, because they're designed to enable triggering Prowess as often as possible, which frequently means less immediate direct damage than some other potential options like you might see in a traditional burn deck.
Yeah, so let's go through the different cards kind of bucket by bucket for the traditional mono red Prowess core deck. So what it really starts with is the creatures, right? And some would say, I think that the most important cards, the cards that make this deck work the most, are Soulscar Mage and Monastery Swiftspear. They are 2 different 1 CMC red spells. They're 1/2s, and they have Prowess. We don't have to read them more than that. You just you have 8 1-drops that have Prowess that have different things. Monastery Swiftspear has haste. Soulscar Mage has that sometimes worthless and sometimes incredible withering effect that goes with your burn spells. But that's what it is. These two creatures allow you to put on really strong pressure very, very early and also have enough power to be playable late game if you need to use them now. Obviously, they're worse in the late game, but you still can cobble together a game plan based on them because they are so cheap. Each of the different takes on these builds, they build it out to there, but these 8 cards are the core of every single deck that we look at when it comes to prowess. There's no reason for them not to be, right?
Yeah, it really wouldn't be much of a deck, I think, if we didn't have these 8 creatures.
Yeah. Generally, the other card that's in many of these decks, or some of these decks, I guess, is Bedlam Reveler. It's kind of the top of the chain, right? Occasionally, you have a 2-drop like Kiln Fiend in the mix, but really, Bedlam Reveler is the thing that allows you to have something that goes from, threats that are good in the early game to a threat that's good in the mid to late game, because Bedlam Reveler draws you cards and also has a decent body with prowess attached to it.
What's good about Bedlam Reveler too is it has, it looks like a crazy card, right? 6 red, but because the cost reduction is 1 generic mana for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, you just get the cost reduction naturally by playing out your game plan. And then it also has prowess. So it's also a prowess creature that then is hopefully using the cards you're drawing off the top. And then anything else that you get off the top after you get those 3 cards is just increasing the damage output. And I think I found Bedlam Reveler to lead some of my most convincing and interesting wins, where it's like turn 7, I'm doing like 16 damage or something.
Yeah. I'm going to refer to the episode that we did with Ryan Overturf back in April, I think a few times tonight. But one of the big things that I got out of that episode when I was talking with him was just a reminder that Bedlam Reveler is not a card to be glossed over. And it's super powerful. It does wild things. It saves you from really sticky situations. It's a card that you shouldn't cut from the deck lightly. And in fact, 2 of the variants that we have tonight did cut this card, but I think they have good reasons.
Importantly, do you think that Bedlam Reveler is like the demon in the art, or is it like that little knight guy walking across like the lava bridge?
It's definitely the demon.
Yeah, because it's creature type devil horror.
Well, maybe he's just a devil horror in armor, trying to escape his mad stepbrother for stealing his Nintendo.
This sounds like the start of a They Might Be Giants song. Can we move on before we get to a second verse?
Yeah, don't let's start, Dave, okay?
So one thing that I wanted to point out that's interesting is that, unlike some aggro decks that rely a good amount on creatures, prowess decks actually are pretty threat light in general. The decks that we looked at today only played between 12 and 17 threats in total, each one. And so in some decks, it's basically 4 Bedlam Reveler, 4 Monastery Swiftspear, 4 Soulscar Mage. And the other ones, they kind of up it a little bit, but that's the range. It's barely more threats than Burn, I think, if you think of it that way.
With worse spells, too.
Okay. More, you can talk about that later. So let's talk about the spells that Stan just espoused so much love for. The spells that we want in prowess generally have a few qualities that we're looking for, right? They're cheap, they're powerful, and if they can, they draw us a card.
Or they're cheap and draw us a card and do 1 point of damage.
Yeah. I mean, is that so much to ask for?
Sometimes they draw 2 cards to the exile zone, so you can't even interact with them.
So these are the main 3 things that we're looking for. And you'll notice that they're prevalent in the sets of cards that are present in each build as things kind of iterate off of the main core. That's what it is. But there are 3 spells that are present in every build of prowess in one form or another. There's Lightning Bolt, of course, right? Great red card. It's removal. It's reach. My second child is named after it. The second card that's pretty much always a 4 of is Lava Dart. It's really good utility. It lets you extend your mana for extra damage or extra spell triggers with its flashback ability.
Yeah, it's like a single point of damage as cast. Like that's a limitation, right? So it's like you have to cast it and then recast it from the graveyard, ditch a land, you get 2 damage out of it. So it's like it's tricksy. It's a tough card on rate sometimes.
Well, I think that's one way to look at it, and we might get into this later, but the prowess triggers mean that each side of Lava Dart is at least 2 damage, if not more, depending on how many creatures you have. So
well, it's a situational damage, Stan, as we'll talk about.
And then the last card that's basically in all these decks is Manamorphose. Manamorphose is just a card that's pretty much broken. You can fix your mana a little bit. You can get an extra spell trigger and draw a card. It lets you have your turn 2s suddenly turn into turns where you play 4 spells or something like that. Like there's a lot of wild stuff you can do with Manamorphose. The last card I would talk about quickly that's really important, we mentioned it earlier, is Light Up the Stage. The red-black version doesn't run it, which I felt like was kind of surprising. But this deck goes through a lot of cards, it wants lots of cards. And so when Light Up the Stage was printed, that was basically the engine that really made this style of deck possible. People thought they were going to put it in Burn. It hasn't totally found a home in Burn as it's turned out, but it's really important to this deck because you can cast it for 1 mana. It gives you a spell trigger and it gives you some extra cards for your hand that sometimes you can just play right away. One of the best plays you can make off of Light Up the Stage sometimes is to fire it off turn 2 off of a Lava Dart when you already have a Monastery Swiftspirit out. So all of a sudden you're doing this like massive turn 3.
You can even get it for no mana with like a Gut Shot effect or flashbacking a Lava Dart out of the board.
Yeah, like a brief strategic aside here is, I think, Dave, what you said is really important and makes sense because I feel like this deck is often more about like big turns than chipping away. And so like setting yourself up with that Light Up the Stage, you're getting a little bit of damage like that turn 2, right? But then turn 3 can often be much bigger because you have access to more cards, more spells, likely more mana, and that then sets up, maybe even another prowess creature, which then sets up kind of that larger turn that can be really big damage. And I'm sure we're going to get into those aspects later. But I think that's something that you might be tempted to be like, okay, I'm going to save my Light Up the Stage to when I'm, hellbent or top decking or something like that. When in fact, it might just be better to see those cards now and have access to like a 5-card hand rather than say, okay, now I'm empty. Now I can fire off my Light Up the Stage.
Absolutely. I think that the way that I think about this a lot, and we'll talk about it later, is it's about chipping away until you can have a big turn.
Sure.
That's kind of another way to think about it too. At any rate, to close out the spells section, there's basically between 24 and 28 spells in each of these decks. Most of the decks have between 18 and 19 lands, so that's kind of like the general constraints of the construction of a Prowess deck. 12 to 17 creatures, 24 to 28 spells, 18, 19 lands. As far as spells that you're looking for to fill out the rest of your deck, you're basically looking for new cheap cantrips. You could have like a Crash Through style effect, Mishra's Bauble, others. Like those are cards that definitely will open my eyes when I think about stuff that I can potentially play in Prowess. The mono red version has extra burn to fill in the rest of its build, and the other decks have other things. But that's kind of how the spell suite is put together and really how the decks are constructed as like an outline goes.
So do you think this all just adds up into like go fast deck?
Yeah, I've heard plenty smart people say like this is the de facto aggro deck, right? And I think, Dave, that you and some other people don't necessarily think about it that way.
I thought the smartest people of all were saying that this is the new Infect.
We did say that at one point in time as well.
Yeah, I know.
I think it's weird. So as part of the prep for this episode, like I mentioned, I went back and listened to our bonus app with Ryan Overturf, noted Prowess enthusiast in Modern, very into dispelling preconceptions about cards that should or should not make it into this deck. Like he's pretty tied to loving the mono red version. So I feel like the other builds in this wouldn't necessarily interest him. But so I wanted to make sure I had a good recollection of the topics we covered here and how we could build on it. So go back and listen if you want to hear about like what he has to say about how to build Prowess, how to play it, and all those kind of things. But on my re-listen, 2 things really stuck out, and I want to talk about them here quickly for a second, and we'll probably talk about them throughout the whole episode. One is, Ryan said that Prowess is a deck that can threaten a turn 3 kill, but also has the ability to close out a game that gets to turns 7 and 8, is what Pete kind of said. The second thing that he said is Prowess is not a burn deck, it's a tempo deck. And when I listened to that again just now, because we've been having some discussion about the right way to approach playing this, that really stuck for me because I think these are related to each other, and they also kind of inform the way that he kind of thinks you should attempt to pilot the deck, which is basically, part of this deck's bad reputation is because people think that all you can do with it is go fast. And so they compare it unfavorably to burn in certain situations, which is a deck that mostly has to go fast in order to win. Whereas I think that cards like Bedlam Reveler, cards like Light Up the Stage, in the other builds, cards like Tarmogoyf and other things in the red-black version like Luris, they help you have a mid-game plan. And that's the reason that these other versions exist.
Yeah, I definitely think that's like an area of weakness in my thinking about this deck because I just feel like I need to close the game out quickly because I sort of have this feeling that the individual values of my cards are kind of low and I like need to cash them in when I see some kind of opening or a potential opening, right? But it's often not a great call because I'm not actually maximizing my long-term damage. And I think that's a consequence of not having enough reps to think ahead enough. And as we've talked a lot about in the past, is thinking ahead is probably the most fundamentally good skill that you can have in a game like Magic is what's happening next turn, what's happening 2 turns or 3 turns. What can I set myself up for and what my opponent do to give me an opening? And like with something like Burn, each card is ostensibly like has a baseline amount of damage. But Prowess, that baseline is different and it's frequently just lower as printed on the card. But because of the synergy and the synergistic nature of Prowess as a deck, you have to use each card at the most opportune way in time to maximize that damage. And so that's kind of the struggle I constantly feel is like, when do I use this lava dart? Because it's only if it only does 1 point of damage and I swing for like 2 with a Prowess creature, is that really the best use I can get out of that card? And the answer is almost certainly no.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all that subtlety of getting practice in and trying to figure out, is this a game where I can go fast? The coast is clear. A game where I have to go fast for some reason because someone has a combo or something that they're trying to do that's not interactive. Tron, for example. Or is this a game where I'm going to transition into a late game, lose some early advantage, have to rebound and come back and deal the last 7 points of damage to someone a few turns down the road. So I think that, that really highlights how this deck is different from Burn because Burn doesn't always have ways to be able to recover later on if you gets into top deck mode, where I think that Prowess does in a lot of different ways. But before we get to that, I did utter some words that I would love to get your take on a minute ago, and that is, TDD hosts, what's a tempo deck?
I keep hearing that. I hear it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean
let's start the biggest Reddit reply thread in our podcast history by tackling this nearly unanswerable question from Magic's history.
That's the whole reason we started a podcast is to make people upset with us on Reddit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I thought we started this to get spoiler cards from Wizards.
Well, we burned that bridge this episode.
We're on to other things.
So I always thought a tempo deck was one that runs cards that bounces creatures back to their opponent's hand.
Well, I don't know, Dave. You had some choice notes here. I'll take a little load off your voice and read some of these, right? So MTG Wiki, tempo is a term to describe the pace at which one plays threats. Some people consider it as one of the most fundamental components of Magic. Tempo decks operate on the premise that any type of disruption spell can be converted into damage, given a superior board state. While all aggressive decks do this to a degree, tempo decks lean heavier on conditional disruption that are more punishing to particular answers.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds a little bit like what Stan just said, right?
Yeah.
Bouncing a card.
What's the most tempo card of all time? It's
Vapor Snag.
Unsummoned?
Vapor Snag. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, Vapor Snag. I mean, I think that that's reasonable. What were some of the other fun statements that I found?
Reed Duke 2014. Mana is a resource, and one aspect of tempo is making sure your mana doesn't go to waste. So using your mana is an aspect of a tempo deck, probably. A tried and true strategy is to deploy a lot of cheap creatures and try to win the game before your opponent can answer them all or have time to cast more powerful spells. While plenty of creatures cost only 1 or 2 mana, the vast majority of answer cards are more expensive than that. Maybe in 2014, Reed. A lot of his discussion is in the idea that we're using our cards faster than our opponents and with better mana efficiency. Okay, Lab Maniac from a nice Reddit thread last year. Tempo decks in general play cheap threats and cheap spells, supporting and protecting those threats. The combination of control and aggro. This means that cards that are generally less powerful but cheaper. That can mean cards that are generally less popular and cheaper. The tempo deck might prefer Spell Pierce over Negate because the 1 mana difference matters to them. since they want to use as much of their mana on pressure as possible. That makes good sense.
I actually, in a way, felt like that was the clearest answer because it sort of places several different decks together that maybe we don't think of as being similar. In my mind, now this will probably get me blown up on Reddit too, but in my mind, I've started to think over the last couple of weeks that Prowess is actually more like Death Shadow than it is like Burn in a way, because it's basically just cheap spells deck, right? And that's what it is. It's like, how do we have spells that draw cards, have cheap effects, get reused more often, and leverage that for some kind of advantage?
So I feel like the common thread in some of these definitions is that tempo or tempo decks refer to the specific mana cost of the spells, creatures, or whatever you put into your deck. And I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that as just like tempo means cheap spells. Because you can have like tempo strategies that are doing powerful things at 2 to 4 mana.
And almost every aggro deck is cheap spells, fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
This makes me think kind of back on our advantage episode and like examining the types of advantages decks are trying to create and then create the win with. And like maybe with tempo, you do have the cheap creatures and cheap spells, but I think there's the additional expectation of disruption in some way, because that is what allows you to create a more significant or potentially more significant mana and like a virtual card advantage. It's like maybe tempo advantage is like the sort of standalone, cup of advantage, right? And like, keeping someone off their game plan because of the threats you're presenting and then the answers you're representing is often preventing them from winning their game or advancing their game plan. So that's like a subtle difference, right? Where it's not just pressure, it's like pressure plus potential answers, like even like a prowess trigger to get something out of bolt range or something like that.
Yeah, Shane, I like that a lot. And I think it really comes down to that combination of both like creatures and aggression, but also making sure that whatever your opponents are doing with their mana doesn't actually, as you put it, advance their plan. So whether that's bouncing a creature back or bolting it, as long as you have a creature on the board and they have an empty board, you've now basically undone their investment to the board while maintaining that advantage, be it a board advantage or a tempo advantage, however you want to put it.
All right. I think that's good. Let's see how that holds as we discuss the deck from here. So,
well, 4 decks, really.
Right. Stan, you want to take us through the different flavors of the Neapolitan ice cream that is Prowess we have to share today?
Sure, I'd love to. I'll go through the decks, who played them, and just like a quick little superlative introduction to all of them. We'll talk about the blue-red version. We've all played this one on the podcast. It's currently the most popular version of Prowess, and it was essentially born out of the power of Core 21's Stormwing Entity, also using blue for Sprite Dragon often. The occasional opt as well, and some interactive sideboard pieces, such as Spell Pierce or Aether Gust. Again, trying to disrupt their opponent's plan while also presenting some of these powerful threats. There's the red-black version, which Dave played for this week's episode. And this is really a relic of the Companion era. Red-black uses black for Luris in the sideboard to help buy back some of these super fragile 1-drop or 2-drop creatures, as well as generate extra value off cards like Mishra's Bauble or Seal of Fire, which you can continually buy back to either present additional prowess triggers, maybe go to the face, maybe kill creatures in the side, or draw you cards as well. Sometimes the red-black version will also have hand disruption or unearth. There's the fringiest deck of all, which is red-green, and I played this one. This version uses green for bigger threats than just the prowess creatures, though they're obviously there as well. This one will run Tarmogoyf and Hooting Mandrills. It also gains access to some unique sideboard technologies such as Klothys, Choke, and Ancient Grudge. And this deck usually has a copy of Yagantha. Is it Gigantha? Yagantha?
I'm good with the soft J if you want. Sure.
Yeah, it's got
Giganta.
It's got Giganta in the sideboard too.
Giganta.
Hey, I love the Pixies.
Big elk.
A big elk.
So good. We should do a Pixies
this I
podcast
know.
after the dive down runs its course.
My medium bad band from like 10 years ago used to cover that song. Actually,
And we're going
Cool
to...
story, Dave.
It's a good one. It's a fun one to sing.
Man, I wish I got to hear that band. So
It's up on Vimeo, but I'll never tell anybody where it is.
And of course, we're going to frame these 3 2-color decks against the original mono red version. We've all played some version of this deck on the podcast before and after the Faithless Looting ban. Arguably, this is the standard by which all other Prowess decks are measured against. This version is very fast, it's aggressive, and Bedlam Reveler can help it be resilient too. So I gotta ask, we're going to try to dive into 4 decks, more or less. Do you think it's novel to see this consistent shell of like these Prowess creatures, Lightning Bolt, Manamorphose, and Light Up the Stage exist across 4 otherwise distinct strategies?
What just popped into my head is control decks. So a lot of control decks will have like a similar spell suite, but then the accoutrement, like apart from the fundamentals, is a little bit different. Like maybe it's a Stoneblade deck, maybe it's an Uro style deck. Like, you know, it's what speed, what threats do they want to offer? That's the only thing I can think of that's like remotely similar. And even that is very different. Like a Sultai control deck is very different than an Azorius based one or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you said Uro, you kind of hit the nail on the head. There's definitely a bunch of people messing around with Uro plus Reclamation in Modern these days, or just kind of Uro decks. And it's kind of, we got Sultai Uro, we got Bant Uro, and we have Teamer Uro. Those are all different flavors of a similar shell.
Urza is another card. And maybe this is just one of those things where it's like, what's the most powerful card or a set of cards that is in the color combination that we can modify and tweak? And I think that if we're saying that some of the most aggressive or tempo style cards can be these red aggressive spells and red aggressive creatures, and then it's kind of season to taste and meta, that's another aspect of that aspect of Magic.
Yeah, your season to taste for metagame, I think, kind of gets at something that I've really observed from both being and paying attention to these Prowess decks, where I believe the decision to splash a second color beyond just the mono red version has to solve like 1 or 2 types of problems that seem to me recur in these Prowess style decks. And the first problem is the threats. They're small and there are few of them, and they're really easy to, answer from opposing mid-range or burn style strategies. And the other one I think is the interaction problem, which is extra colors give these Prowess decks tools that you can use to interact with opponents as well, that you might not have in a mono red shell. Like mono red is never going to be able to answer an enchantment. But if you go to like some of these other colors, you have these additional tools that might be able to address whatever's happening in the metagame around you.
Yeah, I would say really quickly that is very similar to the way that Death Shadow ends up in different colors, I think.
Yeah, perfect example, Dave.
It becomes like, do you want to play Summer Denial or do you want to play Traverse the Ulenwald? Maybe you want to play both. Sometimes, do you want to have space for Lightning Bolt? Like that's a lot of what goes on with that deck as well. And I don't think it should be a surprise to anybody that those are similar cards that we think about playing in Prowess too. Not Stubborn Denial, of course, but there's other, it's a similar impulse.
So again, as I mentioned, this is a more ambitious style of dive episode. And rather than going through the minutia of every single card and every single strategy that all 3 to 4 of these decks have, we're instead going to take a minute to basically expound on what some of our experiences, reactions, and observations looked like playing these different versions, whether it was how we felt about some of the cards, how we felt about some of the spells, and whether or not we think that our versions of Prowess have legs. So to start, Shane, I was really excited for you to play Izzet Prowess because it's like a deck that Dave and I latched onto early, though he and I have like different opinions of how much we enjoy this deck. I gotta hear, where do you fall? Did you like playing Blue-Red Prowess?
Did I like playing it? Sure. It's enjoyable to play.
Sure.
Are the results of my games what I was hoping for? No, but I think it's less on the deck and more on me. And I've kind of been, I think, hinting in earlier strategic asides is that I think that you can mischaracterize your role and where you are in the game fairly easy with this deck. And you can say something like, it's turn 2 and I have 2 creatures out and I can get like 7 damage in. And maybe it's the time to do that, and you leave yourself empty-handed, and maybe not. And so I'll talk a little bit about the deck before I kind of get into the strategic implications of how this deck might play out. So I think this is kind of already a known quantity, the Izzet Prowess deck, because it's really, like you said, it's the most popular version of the deck right now. But I hadn't had much experience beyond like the old Red Prowess decks, and I wanted to see what this variant felt like. And so I tested Ganyan Chin's Izzet Prowess deck from the Mana Traders Modern 15K, because they finished 3rd overall. And I was like, well, if they did well with it, might as well test it. Players, like you said earlier, Stan, I think players have been stretching the old Red Prowess decks into blue, mostly since Stormwing Entity hit print, because it's really tempting to want to enable this evasive 3/3 with Prowess as early as turn 2, right? And people have also been wanting to find a home for Sprite Dragon, which has that Prowess-like ability text as well. And so there was a pressure to add an increased density of good creatures. And these are good, cheap creatures with Prowess. And that really inspired people to tinker and develop what's now already this popular Izzet Prowess build that we're seeing in pretty much every tournament list for the past weeks.
Yeah, well, I'll just throw in one note really quick. There's a lot of tension around trying to figure out what a good 2-drop for Prowess could be. And I think that's another impetus for where these builds come from. And essentially, that's what the blue deck is.
Yep.
Storming Entity is a 2-drop. Sprite Dragon's a 2-drop.
So Storming Entity is good. It's very easy to enable getting it onto the battlefield. And the Scry is really great because you are able to set up some action off the top of your deck. And it's a very good attacker. What's interesting about it, though, is that it does require some thought to potentially hold some spells back if feasible, because if you draw this off the top and you're just top taking after that, that can be rough, because you can find yourself where okay, I drew this. Oh, next turn I drew a land. Next turn after that, I drew Soulscar Mage, and this thing is just sort of rotting in your hand as opposed to being on the battlefield where you really need it. And so I definitely played a game or two where I was like not thinking about the potential of top decking Storming Entity, and that did hurt me. Sprite Dragon was okay. I think there's a reason this is run in fewer numbers, and one is the fact that it costs 2 mana and then only hits the battlefield as a 1/1. You get haste and flying, and those are really valuable. And the permanent buff with the +1/+1 counter instead of the prowess buff is nice, but it's harder to get the card out of bolt range the turn you cast it. And then it, of course, can just die to Fatal Push at any point during the game. So we talked a little bit about the novel creatures in this deck. I think the spells are where things get a little bit more different between Izzet and traditional Red. The Red Prowess deck of even a few months ago is running a little bit more burny spells. So you have things like Lava Spike. You might have some Wild Slashes. You are going to have some, probably a full play set of Crash Through is typical. In place of those spells, this deck's running more like quote unquote free spells like Mutagenic Growth and more gut shots. They'll have main deck Opt as a cheap cantrip in blue that obviously Red's not going to run. And I think the goal of these spells is ostensibly to provide more reasonable enabling of that early Stormwing and also providing potential protection from Bolt.
Yeah.
So Stormwing's a 3/3 before any prowess triggers. And then any instant spell you cast in response to a bolt on the other side is just potential protection. So you tap out for that Stormwing, you have a gut shot or a Mutagenic Growth, or maybe even a Lava Dart from your graveyard. That passes the bolt test. And I think there's some significant pros and cons to this, because something like 5 total gut shots and Mutagenic Growths aren't really doing a lot of good work by their lonesome, right? Like these aren't necessarily great cards by themselves. But something like a Lava Spike is always 3 damage to your opponent. Always. Unless they counter it. So that's why I mentioned earlier the synergistic nature of Izzet Prowess, where every card needs to be used in the most opportune time and method to be maximized. So Gut Shot's sometimes challenging to be worth a card because it's just doing 1 damage. Mutagenic Growth is great when the coast is clear, right? But it's rough as heck to time if your opponent's representing a Fatal Push or a Path to Exile, and all you have is that Soulscar Mage on the battlefield.
Okay, I want to talk for a quick second here about feels versus reals, and I'd love both of you guys to maybe check me here. Is Mutagenic Growth worth a card if you're basically using it as a counterspell against Lightning Bolt?
Yeah, I think it is in this deck because you have to set up that 3/3 Prowess creature, and so if you lose that, it's such a huge setback for you that you're basically playing it as like a Spell Pierce or something like that, right? Like so, it has to. That's one reason that you would play a card like this, I think. I don't know if it's worth it though.
The big difference is that you're playing it not like Spell Pierce, you're playing it like Mental Misstep against Lightning Bolt decks because it does not cost any mana. And so you can tap out early, you can use it as part of an Alpha Strike with a few 1/2s to be able to get you really over the top. I mean, I found this aspect of this deck to be really powerful and useful as long as I'm playing against decks that frequently have Lightning Bolt in them. So it's a little meta dependent, but I think it's definitely worth it.
So then, Dave, does that mean you're only spending Mutagenic Growth to pump an attacker against, a potential Lightning Bolt deck if it means lethal on that turn? Are you just holding it in your hand until, as a protection spell, at least until you know that I'm going to win here if I connect?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's the way that I approach playing most of Prowess, is holding cards as long as possible until I have them dead. So I'm not just emptying my hand just to empty my hand. I'm holding my cards and attacking for 2 or 3 and then seeing if they do anything. If they do something, I play a spell. Mm-hmm. If they don't do something, then I just wait. And then, I try to disrupt them, their turn 3 and turn 4 plays, keep my creatures coming in. And then hopefully I get an Alpha Strike in there at some point, and that's the game.
This is an interesting aspect of the tempo nature of the deck too, right? Which is if someone's holding up a Fatal Push and you swing in for 1 damage, then they're not as tempted to push it, right? So like you're basically saying, use that now or waste your mana.
Yeah, definitely against Fatal Push. I'm trying to play a little game of chicken where it's like, how much damage do I have to do to you with this card for you to use that Fatal Push that I know you have?
So I wonder, does then your approach change when you've got something like Lava Dart or Gutshot in hand and the Light Up the Stage? At that point,
absolutely.
So like at that point, are you actually unloading your hand a little bit more aggressively for the purpose of setting up Light Up the Stage, or are you okay with just dealing 1 point of damage and then using Lighting Up the Stage during your second main?
Yes. That's a really contextual question for me. But yeah, it's either one. Like sometimes I will fire off Lava Dart pre-combat, Light Up the Stage pre-combat, play a land from Light Up the Stage, play another spell and attack. Yeah. Other times I'll leave up all my instants, swing in, accept that I'm only going to get 1 damage off of it, and then Light Up the Stage post-main and get ready for the next, or post-combat and get ready for the next turn. So there's a lot. That's the kind of like tempo nature of the play. And the other thing I would say here is that, if we're just going to get into it now, Gutshot and Lava Dart are really good against certain types of decks in the meta, right? Mm-hmm. I've talked before about how good they are against a deck like Infect. They're actually pretty good against blue-white Uro control decks because you get to kill Coatl with them, or you get to try to kill Coatl with them anyway. And so a lot of times when they have to play a 2-mana spell, you Gutshot it for nothing, and then they have to force a negation it or something like that to get your guy, you come out pretty ahead in the exchange. So it really depends on the meta, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're great against humans too. Like it's kind of unintuitive maybe, but like humans will play a bunch of 1/1s that scale up before they cast their 3/3 flying vigilance haste Mantis Rider. That's the one.
But the big thing for me here is yeah, exactly. The big thing for me here is just I try to hold the cards for as long as I can so that I have the options later.
And Shane, did you have to learn that by playing it? Did you have Dave's insight before you played it? Or
I'm not sure I ever learned it, honestly. I think it's just that's one of the challenges is how do I set myself up for wins? And like the only deck I played a decent amount that does that is like Infect in the past, and this is very different because it has less protection inherently into the deck. And so you're sort of saying like, how do I set up a board state that then allows me to burst and infect is typically more chip damage. Sometimes you get that sweet burst, but a lot of times also it is kind of like maneuvering yourself to a win. I just want to get back to the blue spells so that we can get onto the other decks. The most common main deck blue spell is Opt, and that feels like a natural fit to the deck. It's not doing damage though, but it does give you like this cheap cantrip to dig through your deck, give you a little bit of card selection. Is it better than Crash Through? I mean, maybe, probably. It must be if it's being played like this, but
I think the reason that it's potentially better than Crash Through here is because you have flyers with evasion, and you don't necessarily have to count on Crash Through getting blockers through your opponent's board.
Yeah, I'll also say that I think the other reason is that it's an instant.
It's an instant,
and so you can protect Stormwing Entity with it.
And the sideboard is actually right now not super like leaning into blue. Like really what it's doing primarily are two pieces of cheap and powerful interaction that allow you again to do more of that tempo game, which is Spell Pierce and Aether Gust. So I'm not going to give like a sleeve, believe, or heave on this deck. I just wanted to go over it, kind of provide some insight, and I think we got to move on to Stan with Gruul.
Do we want to talk about, before we move on, because I'm excited to talk about Gruul, I kind of feel like we glossed over Sprite Dragon a little bit. Bit of a contentious card. It was kind of like a late adoption to the blue-red strategy. Did you like Sprite Dragon, Shane?
I mean, I think it's okay. Like I said, I think it's harder to protect on turn 2. I think it's fine as part of like a go wide. If you get a chance to go wide, it hastens the speed at which you can win. So like against Tron, a Sprite Dragon can be great because you untap with it and do a good amount of damage, and then maybe you get one more turn to do even more damage, right? But against a Fatal Push deck, it's like, I don't really care for this.
You know how I feel about Sprite Dragon.
Still cold? You haven't warmed up on it at all?
Necessary evil. I think it's fine. I don't know what card would be better in that slot. I don't think there is one. I also am still kind of conflicted about, like, sometimes I really hate drawing Opt in this deck where I'm just like, thanks, Opt for nothing, and I miss Crash Through, but I think you have to play it. So,
well, Dave, I'll present a candidate for you as a better alternative to Sprite Dragon. It's called Tarmogoyf. Maybe you've heard of it.
I have heard of it.
So I played the red-green version, as I mentioned, and like the key differences here is Goyf, Hooting Mandrills, and then like some other cards that happen to appear in this version that also appear in the red-black version, like Mishra's Bauble and Seal of Fire. So out the gate, I will say I actually liked Goyf a lot. It was kind of like not only a better Sprite Dragon, but it's kind of like a better Runaway Steamkin, where Steamkin you have to do some work to get it big. Goyf is just big. Because it's big. It's already big like after you've cast your spells. You don't have to resolve a Goyf, cast a bunch of spells, and then count on it to stick around. It's just going to stick around.
And that's why Seal of Fire and Mishra's Bauble are there, right? Because they power up Goyf and also power up Hooting Mandrills as well. But
of course. Yeah, so they're obviously there to fuel Goyf, but like Bauble equals a couple points of damage thanks to prowess triggers, and Seal of Fire, in my opinion, is better than something like Gut Shot because, Gut Shot serves this purpose of enabling prowess triggers and enabling Stormwing. Seal of Fire can be like 2 to 3 to 4 points of damage, both because of the prowess triggers and wherever it's like pointing that direct damage to.
Yeah, I mean, as you start sliding out on the scale of what you're trying to do, there's no reason to run Gut Shot in this deck, right? Totally. You don't need to abuse Phyrexian mana when you're moving into the mid game here. You're trying to do a slightly different plan.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, I will say Hooting Mandrills kind of felt like the weirdest include to me because of the occasional tension between it and Goyf. Like, sometimes you have to delve away the only artifact or the only enchantment in any sideboard to get your Hooting Mandrills out, and then you've shrunk your Goyf effectively too. So that doesn't feel great, but there were definitely certain games where it's like, I've presented a 4/4 that's out of Fatal Push range, and either you chain a couple Lightning Bolts, or it's just going to like take over and like maybe force you to double block or whatever. Definitely a potent threat. Didn't feel like the best creature in the deck, but I can also see this maybe like being replaced by something if more minds start focusing on this strategy. Because at the time of recording, I found like 2 copies of Red Green Prowess in like Modern's history, period. And they were identical, for the record. The deck also ran a couple copies of Abbot of Carolkeep, which kind of came and went from the mono red version. It definitely got more popular in the companion era with the black version. And Dave, I'll be curious to hear how you felt about it there. But this was like the best I've ever felt about Abbot of Carolkeep because it wasn't the only 2-drop in this deck. So like if I had a hand where I can do like 1-drop, turn 2 Goyf, turn 3 Abbot of Carolkeep, that was usually pretty good because A, Carolkeep does let you play lands, and B, so many of the cards in your deck are 1 mana that playing Carol on turn 3 meant that like maybe I actually got a little bit of card advantage off of it as well. Not to mention that like extra point of power makes some of those prowess triggers even more punishing. Definitely gets even better late game. Like this was a card I was actually usually happy to have in my hand or to draw later in the game, as opposed to something like a Soulscar Mage might be kind of feels bad when you draw it on turns 5. I do want to mention the companion. This was my first time playing with Yagantha, and it's there because it's just free to include. You don't really have to stretch your deck at all to put it in there. The only condition it needs to meet is that none of your spells have like 2 pips of 1 color. And I will even admit, like, I forgot about it a lot just because like the games would end so early or it's like not really intuitive to your game plan. And there was one game against humans where I could have fetched the Yagantha from the companion zone, but I forgot about it. And my opponent reminded me by naming it with Meddling Mage.
You're like, oh, good. Well, you got your value out of it then.
For sure. And like, I will say, casting this on turn 5 does help stabilize games. Like, 5 mana, 5/5 is still good enough for Modern, I think, just because it gets out of Fatal Push range. And like, you need a pretty like concerted effort to get it off the board. I mean, just to cut to the chase, even though maybe at first glance this deck looks a little slower and clunkier, it can still kill quickly. Even though it cuts Gut Shot, it still has the 4 Lava Darts, which allowed me, at least in one match, to get a turn 3 kill against Tron. And using a Lava Dart to pick off 1/1 Walking Ballista that my opponent had put there to just like present a blocker, I was still able to convert like enough damage to the face and prowess damage to clear that Walking Ballista and swing in for the kill. I think I had exactly lethal, so felt cool. And I think that's kind of one of the like most important things to be able to do with a prowess style deck. Whether or not like red black can do that, I'm curious to hear your take. But the fact that it can both threaten this turn 3 kill or like the turn 8 kill is something like 2 boxes that I felt this deck checked off. And that's why it seems like in the right metagame, or maybe based on like your own personal preferences as a player, like this could be a defensible choice. Might feel really bad in a metagame full of like Jund and Death Shadow where your creatures are going to eat Fatal Push for days. Otherwise, like, I didn't think that this was like obviously immediately worse than any of the other versions that I've played.
Stan, do you feel like it did shore up some of the ostensible like weaknesses of red, or is it where it's like, you know, my creatures are big enough to dodge burn, my creatures are big enough to block aggressive creatures on the ground?
Kinda, yeah. And there have been points where I like stopped playing Prowess, including recently with the blue-red version, just because I felt like I was just too late to play it. And when Lightning Bolt is the most popular card in the format, like Prowess can have a really hard time, in my opinion. Just because like removing creatures can be really backbreaking since you can't count on like Gut Shot and Lava Dart to do burn damage to close the game.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think that Red Blue Prowess is good when Lightning Bolt is good. Like that's part of why I think the Red Blue deck was good, and maybe potentially can be good because of the Phyrexian mana, Storming Entity, Lava Bolt or Lightning Bolt test, all that kind of stuff. I think that this deck is probably a little bit better if you expect someone to not have like ground threats in the way. So if the coast is clear for Tarmogoyf and Hooting Mandrills to do their thing, this could be a better choice in that particular metagame.
I mean, the other thing that I thought it shored up were opponents that knew to bring in life gain. So, like, if my opponent played a Weather the Storm, yeah, that sucks. But if I have like a 4/5 or a 5/6 Tarmogoyf, that's still going to get the job done eventually. And I thought that was one of the places where I really liked what this deck gave me access to, was like these consistently big creatures that I didn't have to like count on having a handful of burn spells to grow.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me as well.
So David, you've now played the most Prowess decks of all.
You've played 3 and I've played 3. Right, I haven't played.
I guess we're tied.
We're tied. Yeah, we're tied on the leaderboard. So yeah, I played the red-black deck. I played Doomwake's deck from the Mana Traders July series as well, which I think went 8-1 in the Swiss and was a top 8.
Wait, I think I just realized we all played Mana Traders top 8 decks, because
yes,
that's just like where we defaulted to.
Well, I mean, I think it was the most recent source, and it was what we talked about last week for the breakdown, so it kind of was just a natural place to start for these. And yeah, one of each of them made the top 8. So that's another reason that we thought that this would be an interesting episode to do. Little peek behind the curtain there. The big headline with this deck is that I think it is the longest game plan version of the deck, and has some like play choice decisions that I made that I think deviate pretty significantly from that idea that Prowess has to be an aggro deck. And additionally, the big headline of this deck is that this is a companion deck, and not just because it can do it, but because it's a big part of the plan, because it still runs Lurrus out of the sideboard. And in a lot of ways, some of the engine part of this deck is the same as the red-black deck was when Lurrus was around, fully formed pre-nerf, because it still tries to use Lurrus to create a powerful kind of card advantage engine via Mishra's Bauble and Seal of Fire, like Stan mentioned at the top of the episode. They're keys to a deck that wants to be able to grind and replay cards, take it a little bit slower, not super slow, but still kind of like switch something that is ostensibly aggressive and strong into something that's a bit more kind of mid-rangey. And the way that it does this is through adding black, right? So you need black to cast Lurrus, but also the deck extends into black for basically 3 things. One is non-damage based removal spell. It runs Fatal Push. Runs a 3 of Fatal Push right there. It's obvious why it's good. Helps in longer matchups. It's cheap. It runs Thoughtseize as 4 of. So it's great, I think, and interesting in this deck to have the dimension of being able to check if the coast is clear or not when you are about to cast a creature spell. You can Thoughtseize someone and then take a look and then play your Soulscar Mage, or you can go a different way if you need to. I wasn't sure if it was right, but there were times where I played Thoughtseize on turn 1 still, like you would traditionally expect to do when you are playing a Thoughtseize deck, even though I had Soulscar Mage in my hand, which meant that Soulscar couldn't attack till turn 3, because it felt like I just want to check, maybe take the removal spell, and then I know that my threats are going to stick. And then the last thing is that it runs a main deckable piece of graveyard hate in interesting Theros Beyond Death All-Star Cling to Dust. It's the first deck I've played with Cling to Dust, and I got to say, I thought it was really good. I thought it was super useful. It's a little bit of life gain. You get a chance to draw a card off of it if you play it. It's 1 CMC. You can get rid of a problematic card like Uro, so you have a chance against that in game 1. It's tough in the other builds, the other Prowess builds, to be able to know what to do with Uro, and I think that this deck is kind of made to be able to let you be able to hang against it even in game 1. So all 3 of these cards come in handy with one little piece of tech that I liked in Doomwake's build, which is a singleton Dreadhorde Arcanist, which was fun to have access to be able to occasionally go double Thoughtseize, double Fatal Push, double Bolt sometimes. It's not a key part of the deck, but it is a card that you get to run. And then finally, you get to run a couple of other cards. You get to run Kolaghan's Command as a 2 of, which is an interesting way to, a 3 CMC spell is pretty expensive for Prowess, but this has so many options. You get to maybe kill a blocker, make them discard a card, bring one of your threats back. That's a nice thing to have access to in a Prowess deck. And also Unearth, you get to just bring somebody back. And then Lurrus, of course, you get to replay threats. The weirdest thing about this deck is that it cuts back on what I think are 2 of the best cards in the traditional build. One is Manamorphose. It only plays it as a 2 of. Manamorphose was kind of weird to me in this deck. Often I found myself sitting there being like, well, I just have Manamorphose. What am I going to do with this? Or I have Manamorphose and Thoughtseize in my hand, and it's like, So it didn't seem to lead to the same type of explosive hands as I was used to. And then the other thing is that it runs no light up the stage, which was kind of a bummer, but I think you have to do it to be able to run the Mishra's Bauble package. So I guess I get it. We're trading that early game card draw in for something that maybe we can do over and over again. Luris is still like a crazy lightning rod, of course, but the creature suite in this deck was rough to me as well. Stan said that he enjoyed playing 2 of Abbot of Carol Keep. This deck runs it as a 4 of because you need those extra threats. Without Abbot of Carol Keep, you really only have 8 creatures, and that's not great. That's not getting it done. I just don't like this card. I feel like it being an X1 is like never something I'm happy about. It gets pinged all the time. Like, I never know when to play it, when to like count on casting the card off the top, when to not. Like, it's pretty complicated from there. But I think you have to run it, and at least you can replay it with Luris, so it gives you an extra draw later if you do have that in the graveyard to get Luris out.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing, like the key difference between my deck running Abbot and yours is that I only had 2, so I wasn't seeing it as often. And as a result, it kind of felt like I was just seeing it later in the game, more typically than, say, my opening hand, where it might actually feel like a problem. But also, I had more creatures in my deck than you did. Just like my version has the most threats, I think. So if my 1-drops or even my Goyfs are like eating removal spells, then Abbot of Carol Keep, even at 1 toughness, like might just be the one that gets to stick around the longest.
Yeah, absolutely. And like this deck hedges by having Unearth and Kolaghan's Command. I didn't get to do a lot of powerful stuff with those because, newsflash, Path to Exile is pretty popular on Moto right now. So there were some sticky situations where I had to win matches through Path, and that's not always easy for Prowess in general. And, blue-red kind of suffers the worst from that, but this one is also vulnerable to it as well, especially when you're losing Luris. I think having Luris is good. It's totally fine. I think it's still pretty powerful. It's the type of deck where if you flood, sometimes it's nice to have something as a little bit of flood insurance to go and grab that card and then cast it on the next turn. The random mana sink is good. It kind of functions like it wants to be like Bedlam Reveler for you, sort of in a way where it's sort of like a mid-game threat you bring out that lets you draw extra cards or lets you get extra value. And that's good. I had a couple of games where I won via playing Seal of Fire 3 times, and that was just enough to get through. I think the major difference between this deck and the other ones is that, I was just talking earlier about holding up spells for future turns. On this deck, I was really holding up spells for future turns. Like, I was attacking in with 1/2s constantly with this deck and just being able to like kind of grind people out going into turn 6 for the win instead of trying to win on turn 4. It happened a lot. I still managed to do okay with this deck. I got yet another Prowess based 3/2 with this, and I'm in the middle of another 3/2 right now. And so
infinite.
Yeah, I know. Still going infinite with Prowess decks. But that's the big difference here is that I think it's twofold. One is if you want to go into the mid game, this deck is set up to do it the most. And the other one is if you think you're going to be playing against Uro, I think the main deck Cling to Dust are just what make that kind of possible to deal with. Fatal Push helps too, of course. You can occasionally, crack a fetch and kill Uro with a Fatal Push after it's been escaped.
Or just crack a Bauble. Seal of Fire.
Oh yeah, Bauble to Seal of Fire. Yeah, all of those things help enable Fatal Push for sure.
So those are the different versions of Red Prowess, and of course, Mono Red is the one that kind of brought us here in the first place many moons ago. We did touch on this fact that like these aren't burn decks, and we can't really count on these decks to burn opponents out, so to speak. And I think a question that came up a lot in our testing for this episode is, why are we playing this instead of burn? And I have some theories. Maybe I'll present mine to start. Hear you guys react.
Sure.
I'm all ears.
Yeah, so I think the key reason here is that A, it can present or at least threaten a faster kill than burn can. I don't think burn can kill on turn 3, even with its best draws. And B, I think the creatures here are bigger than the creatures in burn ever can be. Like, even if you're just counting on a Swift Spear and a Soulscar Mage, sometimes they're both just like swinging for 6. Thoughts, reacts, wrong answers only.
Shane, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? Is like, what do these decks have over burn? And I think there's like competing takes, like both within the community and with you right here, Stan. You're like, it's really fast and it's faster than burn. But then we're also saying, like, is this an aggro deck? Or is it like a tempo deck that isn't necessarily designed to win super quickly? Is it the new infect of the format? Or is it a deck that can chip away and then put the opponent away with a huge turn? And I think that's kind of tough to wrangle. I really think that one thing that's important is the ability to control the board and get more damage in at the same time due to the density of the prowess creatures, right? Unlike Burns creatures, and I think like what you said, Stan, is that you can get more damage with your creatures in prowess. Burns creatures are really designed to get early chip damage in, and then they get kind of stonewalled, and maybe you're getting some spell trigger damage off of your Eidolon. Prowess creatures can do more damage long term, potentially, while also interacting with the board. Because you're not always really sad to point your burn at a creature in a prowess deck, whereas if you're doing that in burn, you're not super happy, right, Dave?
Yes. Stole my note stealer.
I stole your note.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately I would try to get away from this paradigm of comparing prowess to burn. I don't really at this point think they're fundamentally similar decks. I think one thing that's interesting is like, Stan, this idea of, is it a fast deck, but it's not a deck that has to be fast, is sort of a nuanced question that reminds me of, when I was talking to Michael Rapp about Shadow a long time ago, he said that he always wants to play Shadow with Temur Battle Rage, not because he has to have it, but because he wants to be able to threaten having it. And I feel like that's a similar thing that goes on with prowess here, where it's like, you don't have to win on turn 3 for this deck to work, but it is an important part of the game plan that the potential is there, and your opponent needs to be scared of dying very fast to this deck. And then sometimes they'll make mistakes that give you an opening to win more slowly against them. And so I think we'd be better comparing prowess to that style of deck than burn. Like Shane said, you're okay with killing their creatures with your burn spells in prowess, and you're kind of unhappy about that in burn. So I think if you try to play prowess like burn, you'll lose more games than you should, and you're probably missing kind of an learning opportunity to see how these two decks are really different from each other.
Thinking back to like the very earliest versions of this deck when Arclight Phoenix was still in it, I think version 1.0 had 4 Bolt, 4 Lava Spike, and I think it even had 4 Skewer the Critics. And in a shell like that, like, I think comparing it to burn makes more sense. Because in a shell like that, you might actually get to deal like the last 6 to 9 points of damage with lightning bolt effects, which doesn't really happen here at all because we only play 4 lightning bolts now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just evolved to be a different thing. And even on that episode we did back in April, which again, give it a listen if you're interested, Ryan Overturf was kind of like, prowess was a separate deck when Mono Red Phoenix was also a deck. He's like, I thought that this was better than Mono Red Phoenix because it had a better ability to get to the mid game. Whereas if you screw up your sequencing and you draw a Arclight Phoenix off of Light Up the Stage, you're kind of in trouble. And at the time I was kind of like, no, that's not a big deal. Maybe he was right, but definitely they're distinct plans. Even those two decks are distinct plans. And again, I think it really comes down to, you're not trying to empty your hand and use all your spells as fast as possible. Even though they're bad spells like Lava Dart and Gut Shot, Mutagenic Growth, things like that, you want to try to get value out of them while you're trying to execute your aggro plan. And I guess that is the definition of a tempo deck, right? A cheap spell where you're trying to get your opponent to give you value off of your cheap spells while it still advances your ability to attack.
Poignant. So in the waning minutes of the show, should we yell about spells?
How so?
And argue about whether or not spells like Gut Shot and Lava Dart are good or even worth a card? Because that's the thing that I run into the most often playing any version of Prowess that runs Gut Shot in particular, is like, why am I settling for a deck that runs this bad card when I could play a different deck that has fewer bad cards?
Gutshot's amazing if you're going to be playing against creature decks. Like that's kind of what it boils down to. And it's incredible in blue-red if you need to protect your Stormwing from Bolt.
Is it that good against creature decks? I mean, it's 1 damage, right? So it's like...
Yeah, I mean, it's great against a deck like humans.
Sure.
Like Stan was saying, it's good with Soulscar Mage out to be able to generate a negative, -1/-1 counter to be able to give you an advantageous attacking position. Like there are ways to use it. The big one is I'm going to kill Noble Hierarch, or I'm going to kill Thassa's Lieutenant when it comes into play, or I'm going to kill your infect creature. Like that kind of stuff is important.
Yes.
The big one, honestly, the big one for blue-red prowess is Arbor Elf. Right? Like having that much access to cheap ways to kill Arbor Elf out of the blue-red deck is important. It's great against Icefang Coatl, like I mentioned, where, you have that back and someone thinks they've got you, and then you just go, nope, I'm just going to I'm going to make you counter this, or I'm going to make you force a negation it so this play still goes down the way that you want it to.
It's just so hard for me, and maybe Stan, it sounds like, to just like overlook, like, so conditionally cool. Right? Conditionally, yes, I see what you're saying, Dave. It has conditional uses. But then a lot of times it's like, why am I not just casting Lava Spike? Like, why am I not just playing one card that does 4 damage? Why am I not just playing one card that does 3 damage? Why am I not playing, Eidolon is going to routinely do 3, 4 damage? Like it's really easy to get a lot of damage out of your cards and like to know what the floor is. And you know me, I talk a lot about like potential floors versus ceilings. And for me, it's like, I know what I'm getting out of most of my cards in a deck like Burn. And I don't know what I'm getting out of a lot of my cards in a deck like Prowess. And it's frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, some of that's practice.
Yeah. I think, Shane, one other way I would put it is like, sometimes I wonder, and I don't really have a clear answer or opinion on this just yet, but sometimes I wonder if we're falling into this trap of like playing bad cards to make other cards better.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole idea. It's a synergy.
Right. Rather than being in a situation where we can play like good cards that also synergize with other good cards.
Yeah, but the thing is, these are all cards that can be cast for no mana.
Yes.
At some point in time. And so what you're doing really is trying to break the rules, the most fundamental rule of Magic in the best way possible, which is I'm going to cast more spells faster. And that's kind of what it comes down to. And if I get a card out of those spells, it's absurdly good. If I don't get owned by casting those spells and get an 0 for 1 out of them, like kind of get more card neutral, then it's fine. If I am playing Lava Dart for 1 mana to swing in with my Swift Spear on turn 2 for 2 damage, that's bad. Like that's not what the card is for. You know what I mean? Like it's not a burn spell.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's tempting to say like these spells are bad when I'm not playing Boros Charm, right? And I'm, of course, as guilty as anybody for just trying to lean towards that. I think it's just harder, fundamentally, where it's like it's harder to get the value and to like get all the juice out of that lemon and then, spray it on your opponent.
That's bad manners. You could get disqualified for that.
But think about what you're saying too. The difference between those two things is so vast, right? One of them is 0 mana. The other one is 2 mana. And yeah, you have to make your deck work a certain way to make it work.
Yeah.
But that's the difference. And Boros Charm is like one of the most annoying cards to play against when you're playing Burn. But I always felt like it was one of the cards that I kind of sometimes hated to draw in Burn, because a lot of times I'm like, great, this is just 4 damage, but my opponent's at 10.
Sure.
Like, cool. That's not going to help me get any farther. But Lava Dart has the same problem if you're in a situation where you can't maneuver to get value out of it.
And that's what's frustrating.
Yeah, I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that like wherever you stand on whether these cards are good or not, I think it all kind of depends on like more external forces, where we could be in a situation where like you want to be the pilot of the deck that has a bunch of gutshot effects because you're going to be dealing with a bunch of X1s a lot. Whereas we may be in a totally different metagame in 3 months where you actually just want a turn 2 Goyf instead, and like Seal of Fire is a much more reliable like way to spend a card than what Gutshot or Lava Dart might offer.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that's the most interesting about the fact that these separate shells exist, is that for a long time, it was like Prowess would come and go from the metagame depending on how good those cards were. And now it feels like there's a chance that there just could always be a Prowess deck around because Monastery Swift Spear, Soulscar Mage plus some spells is a good enough thing to build off of in a platform.
Maybe one day the blue-red version might even be a Delver deck.
People have tried so many times. So many times.
All right. Fun discussion, fun decks. Always excited to talk about anything that runs Lightning Bolt. And this time we got to talk about like 3.5 Lightning Bolt decks. So I think this is an absolute win.
It's a full play set of Lightning Bolt decks.
That does wrap up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure that you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or pick our brain on something in Modern or Pioneer, you can tweet us at TheDiveDown, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon. Joining at any tier gets you access to our super secret Slack channel, and days like today, when there's a BNR announcement, that Slack channel is lit. It's lit basically every day. Sometimes it's a little sleepier on weekends because we're not at work and we're hanging out with our families, but most weekdays, especially BNR weekdays, best place on the internet is the Dive Down Slack. Of course, shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring our show. Sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown, all one word, to get 20% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and soul Scar Mage!
Conditional damage.
Was that a Metallica thing? What was that?
Yeah, that was me doing a Metallica thing. Conditional damage is my favorite Ride the Lightning B-side.
Conditional damage.